The improbable birth of Jesus on the silence of a starry night in Bethlehem. A child was brought into the world. Not in a palace, not under the cover of wealth, but in a simple stable. The atmosphere was cold, the smell of straw mixed with hay, and the sound of animals filled the air. The sky seemed to breathe in anticipation of the birth of the one who would transform all of human history. There were no golden chambers, no courtiers waiting with flowers, but there, in that humble moment, the King of Kings made his entrance into the world. The strange contrast between the birth of a king and the setting he was born into would be only the beginning of a journey that would never bow to human pride, but would break down the barriers of arrogance with each step he took. The visit of the Magi came not from a nearby city, but from distant lands, guided by a star. They were prepared to offer precious gifts, a recognition of what they knew to be something grand. But when they arrived at King Herod's palace, they were met with a look of doubt and suspicion. Herod, driven by pride and the fear of losing his kingdom, would soon plan something cruel. While the Magi continued their journey toward the child, the king wove his plots in the shadows, and the world, unaware, was bracing for a clash of great proportions. The humility of Jesus' birth and the arrogance of a monarch met in the same space, creating a tension that would only grow. The flight to Egypt the night following the visit of the Magi, the peace of Bethlehem, was shattered by the order imposed by Herod. An angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, telling him to flee immediately with Mary and the newborn child. The response was swift. They gathered what little they needed and departed. The escape was not to a place of comfort, but to Egypt, a distant land, far from Herod's reach. And in the midst of this journey, once again, the paradox of the story was present. While the powerful plotted and manipulated, God's calling was fulfilled in the simplicity of obedience, going to a place where even the most powerful kings could not reach the grace that dwelt there. The growth and silence of Jesus' years passed, and the story of Jesus grew quiet. There were no records of miracles, no crowds around. Life in Nazareth was simple, hidden in the small details of everyday life. Jesus grew in stature, but also in wisdom and grace. The pride that dominated the hearts around him never touched his soul. He didn't use his authority to stand out or draw attention. He simply walked his path in silence, fulfilling a mission greater than any human recognition. And as life continued its routine, the mystery of the Messiah was being built, molded by obedience, by doing nothing according to human expectations. And in that silence, the path toward the fulfillment of the calling was drawing nearer. The baptism in the Jordan River. Jesus, now about 30 years old, approached John the Baptist at the Jordan River, where John was baptizing those who repented of their sins. When Jesus asked to be baptized, John hesitated, as if he felt the weight of the greatness before him. But Jesus' humility was not of an earthly kingdom. His greatness was revealed in the simple act. When he descended into the waters of the Jordan, it was not an act of necessity, but a revelation of what was to come. The voice from heaven was heard, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." His humility, which did not seek exaltation, was now beginning to reflect the true nature of his power. But what would he do next? The waters were still troubled, and the storm that was coming would only intensify. The temptation in the desert after his baptism, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert, where he would spend 40 days fasting. Alone, with no food, no companions, he was about to face the hardest trial of his journey. The devil, knowing his hunger, tries to use human ego pride, offering a quick solution: turn stones into bread. But Jesus does not give in. He doesn't need to show his authority to prove his worth, because his true strength is in obeying the Father. The tests continue, but each of Jesus' responses does not seek personal glory, but victory over temptations that appeal to pride and self-sufficiency. The desert was not just a physical place. It was the scene where Jesus' heart was being prepared for the future that was already ahead, a future where trials would become his greatest allies, and human pride his greatest enemy. The calling of the first disciples leaving the desert, Jesus begins to call his first disciples. He doesn't approach the rich or the powerful, but simple fishermen. While the great schools of philosophy and religion awaited a more imposing figure, Jesus looked to the hearts of people, seeking those willing to listen and learn. He didn't need followers to affirm his importance. On the contrary, he called them to a greater purpose than anyone could understand at first. Among the disciples was Simon Peter, an impulsive man, ready to face any challenge, but still not fully understanding the depth of the calling being given to him. What Jesus wanted from Peter, more than a disciple, was a heart willing to be transformed. And their journey was about to become more challenging than they could ever imagine. Healing the sick, the fame of Jesus began to spread quickly. People came from all sides to see the man who healed the sick, cast out demons, and restored lives. But what many didn't see was the motivation behind each miracle. Jesus wasn't seeking recognition. He was simply revealing God's love. In each healing, he touched not only the body, but the heart of those who followed him. While the crowds gathered, the religious leaders questioned why he spent so much time with the marginalized, the outcasts of society. The pride of institutionalized religion rose against him, trying to corner him with their rules, but Jesus didn't stray from his mission. What he brought was far greater than any human expectation, and that became more evident with each miracle. When the eyes of faith began to open, new challenges arose. And now, what more would he have to teach? The feeding of the 5,000 one hot afternoon, a large crowd gathered to hear Jesus. There was not enough food for everyone, and desperation began to take hold. But Jesus, looking at the small lunch of a boy, took what little he had and, in a simple gesture, began to distribute it to the disciples. What seemed like an impossible task turned into a miracle. Everyone ate, and there was still food left over. The lesson here was clear. When we place what seems insignificant in God's hands, He makes it multiply. No material abundance was sought, but a spiritual lesson was being solidified. True greatness is not in what we have, but in what we are willing to give. Amid the wonder, once again, Jesus' humility stood out. He didn't want to be applauded for his ability to perform miracles, but for teaching that even in difficulties, trust in the Father brings what is needed. But would the crowd understand the truth behind this multiplication? Calming the storm later, the disciples found themselves in a boat, sailing through a stormy sea, with waves crashing against them and fear seizing each heart. Suddenly, a figure approached them walking on the water. They screamed, thinking it was a ghost, but Jesus calmly said, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter, ever impulsive, challenges the vision, asking to walk to him. And for a moment, Peter walks on the water, but as he looks at the waves, he begins to sink. Jesus catches him, and the storm calms with a word. The irony of it all? When the hardships of life become so great, they almost drown us. The only way forward is to keep our focus on the Master. The pride of self-sufficiency falls away, and the true response to life is trust, even in the most turbulent waves. But would the disciples learn to trust fully in the power they were witnessing? The forgiveness of Mary Magdalene in a house full of Pharisees and morally rigid men. A woman known for her sinful life enters and pours expensive perfume on Jesus' feet. While the men watch in disgust, judging, Jesus looks at her with compassion. He doesn't rebuke her as everyone expects. Instead, he forgives her, showing that a broken heart is more important than any external appearance of purity. Jesus didn't look at the sins, but at the sincere repentance. The irony of it all was that while the proud withdrew, true humility was revealed in the acts of love from that woman. As she stood, restored, the condemning looks began to turn toward those who, in their pride, saw themselves as pure in the eyes of men. Jesus was challenging everything they believed to be the truth about who was worthy of forgiveness. Would this change the course of the story for all those around him? The choice of sinners as disciples, while the religious leaders of the time prided themselves on their purity, Jesus chose those whom society rejected. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, was despised by all, but when Jesus looked at him, he didn't see an irredeemable sinner, but someone ready to be transformed. Zacchaeus came down from the tree, and with a smile on his face, Jesus called him to be his disciple. In Zacchaeus' heart, something began to change. The greed and pride of a life centered on profit started to be replaced by a sincere desire to make amends. Jesus' decision to call him to follow wasn't just about becoming a disciple, but about giving him a new identity. Jesus broke all expectations of who could or could not be transformed. And as this was happening, the other disciples began to ask themselves, would their own transformation be just as radical? The transfiguration on Mount Tabor on a distant mountain. Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John. His face shines like the sun, and his clothes become radiant. Alongside him appear Moses and Elijah. At that moment, the disciples fall to the ground, awestruck, recognizing Jesus' greatness. But what did this mean? They didn't see the pride of power, but the purity of the divine mission. Jesus wasn't trying to impress them with his glory, but with his humility. He, who had come into the world in simplicity, was now revealing himself in all his majesty. And in that moment, greatness wasn't something to be feared, but something to be understood. It was the confirmation that he was the promised Messiah, but his mission was to serve, not to oppress with power. But the question remained, how could the disciples fully comprehend the meaning of that revelation? The conversation with the Samaritan woman on a hot day. Jesus arrives at a well in Samaria and meets a woman who came to draw water. She, a Samaritan woman, was alone, likely avoided by the other women of the town. Jesus begins to talk to her, breaking down cultural and religious barriers. She, surprised, begins to realize she isn't speaking to just any man, but to the Messiah. Jesus calls her to a new life, not based on religion or appearance, but on spirit and truth. The pride of both Jews and Samaritans, who saw themselves as superior, crumbled before the grace that flowed in simple but powerful words. The woman goes to the city, and many begin to believe, changing the perception of an entire community. What was happening there wasn't just a simple exchange of words, but a quiet revolution that began in the hearts of the people. And in the meantime, Jesus was preparing to reveal even more of his kingdom. And so the story continues, leading each one deeper into the understanding of who he truly was and what he was about to do. In the beginning, when the cosmos was a vast expanse of darkness, there was nothing. It was as though the universe itself had not yet found its voice. The air was still, the waters deep, and the earth was yet to take shape. But then, the breath of God stirred the silent void, and his voice, filled with power, rang out like a melody that echoed into the empty silence. "Let there be light," he whispered, and from the depths of the dark, light broke forth, brilliant, radiant, and pure. It filled the heavens, dancing across the darkness like the first notes of a song. And it was good. As the light stretched across the abyss, dividing the day from the night, the world began to form. The sky stretched wide and vast, a canvas of blue unfolding above, and beneath, the waters gathered, calm and deep, separating from the dry land. Mountains rose, tall and proud, like ancient sentinels, while valleys carved themselves in humble surrender. It was a vision of balance, of peace, the beauty of order emerging from the chaos. Then, in the fertile soil, life began to bloom. The earth, once barren, now burst with greenery and vitality. Trees of every kind, their leaves shimmering in the light, their branches reaching towards the sky in worship. Flowers, vibrant and fragrant, bloomed like a chorus of colors, their petals singing in harmony with the wind. The land was no longer a lifeless shell. It was teeming with potential, with promises of life yet to come. And on the fourth day, the stars, those ancient, far-off sentinels, were placed in the sky to mark the days and seasons, to shine as guides through the long nights. The moon, calm and serene, hung like a lantern in the dark sky, while the sun blazed with the strength of 1,000 fires, its rays touching every corner of the earth. But God wasn't done. His work was incomplete. He turned to the waters and called forth creatures of every shape and sighs. From the deep came the whales, majestic and mysterious, while birds took flight in the sky, soaring gracefully, their wings slicing through the air like poetry in motion. The world was alive, a masterpiece in the making. Finally, God turned to the dust of the earth and shaped man in his own image. With a tender, loving touch, he breathed life into him, and man opened his eyes to behold the glory of creation. The earth was his home, the sky his blanket, the waters his lifeblood. God looked upon him, and for the first time, he saw that something was missing. The man needed a companion, someone to share in the wonder of the world. From the man's side, God took a rib and fashioned a woman, delicate and strong, filled with grace and beauty. She was to be his equal, his partner in the dance of life. Together, they walked in the garden, hand in hand with their Creator, basking in the glory of the world he had made. It was a paradise, perfect, whole, untouched by time, and all of creation was good. God saw that everything was as it should be, and with a heart full of love and satisfaction, he rested, looking upon his creation and calling it perfect. The calling of Abraham. In a land where the earth was dry and the skies stretched endlessly above, there lived a man named Abram, whose heart was pure, but whose world was bound by limitations. His life was like a small flame in a world of vast shadows, untouched by the weight of divine promise. But then, in a moment of sacred silence, the voice of God pierced through the stillness. A whisper carried on the wind. Abram, leave your home and journey into the unknown. For I have a plan for you, a promise to make you the father of nations. Abram's heart trembled, for he had never known a call like this, a call so grand and uncertain. But he did not hesitate. He gathered his family, his possessions, and with nothing but faith as his guide, he walked into the wilderness. Each step was a surrender, each mile a leap of trust into the unseen future. And the world seemed to open before him, vast and mysterious, ready to reveal its secrets. Through deserts that seemed to stretch on forever, over mountains that touched the sky, God spoke again. I will give you descendants as countless as the stars in the sky. Your faith will become the foundation of many generations. Abram looked up to the heavens, and for the first time, he understood. Though his eyes could not see the full picture, his heart knew the truth. The promise was real. He walked forward, not knowing exactly what lay ahead, but trusting that the God who had called him would never abandon him. Moses and the burning bush. On the side of a quiet mountain, a man named Moses tended to his flock, the world unaware of the momentous transformation that was about to unfold. The wind whispered softly through the branches of the trees. The earth held its breath, and the air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation. And then, out of the stillness, Moses saw it, a bush, a flame, yet not consumed by the fire, its flames dancing like the fire of God himself. He stepped closer, drawn by the mystery, his curiosity stirring within him. Suddenly, from the heart of the fire, a voice called out his name, Moses, Moses. His name echoed through the mountainside, and his heart stopped for a moment, as though the world had paused to take notice. It was not just any voice, it was the voice of the divine. Take off your sandals, the voice commanded, for you are standing on holy ground. Moses, trembling, obeyed, and in that sacred space, where fire and earth met, God revealed himself in all his power. I have seen the suffering of my people, and I have heard their cries. I am sending you to free them from the chains of slavery. Moses' heart beat wildly, his mind racing. But I am only a shepherd, Lord. How could I stand before Pharaoh? The weight of the task seemed impossible, but the voice was unwavering. I will be with you. And just like that, the path ahead of Moses, once unclear, was lit by the promise of God's presence. Moses, who had once only tended sheep, was now being called to lead a nation. The fire in the bush was more than just a symbol. It was the fire of purpose, burning within his soul. And with that, Moses began his journey, one that would forever change the course of history, a journey fueled by faith and the unshakable knowledge that God had called him to something greater than he could ever imagine.